Hello, everybody. It's nice to be back to Republica. I was here in 2016, I think. Okay. That's the title, as you can see. So, let's start with this picture. What do you see in this picture? What is unusual about it? Yes, there's only one woman without a newspaper peeking on the man's newspaper. They all seem to be reading the same newspaper, apparently, or similar ones. It's the New York Times, I think. No, that guy is reading something else. They're also wearing hats, nice glasses from the 50s, probably. Advertising, different advertisings. We'll come back to this. There's something very unusual about this, obviously, as you can see. So very brief about my own story. I started blogging in 2000. It was called Editor Myself, English and Persian. And I started the blogging movement in Iran. That's why it became a revolution somehow. And it brought me this title, the funny title of the blogfather. Then I came back to Iran because I started it in Canada when I was in Canada in 2000. I went back to Iran in 2007. 2008, and I disappeared. I was arrested. Then I was sentenced to almost 20 years in prison because of my blogs and other digital activities. And then 6 years later, I was released in 2014. And then when I came out as a blogger, I realized this had happened. You might have seen this article. It became quite famous and it was translated into many languages. It was my mourning, in a way, and my surprise, and my attempt at explaining what had happened with the Web 2.0 and social media and all these things that didn't exist in 2008 when I was arrested. So this was a piece in medium.com. If you search for the same title, you can find it. And there's also two German versions in Die Zeit and in 10 magazine. So the basis of the argument, the core of the argument is that the whole shift that we've seen is because of the hyperlink and the way they've been declined and suppressed by the social media. So the social media and the Web 2.0, obviously, which was the beginning of this trend, made the previous internet, which I call books internet, into TV internet. I'll give you 1 minute to look at this shift. From surprise to habits, from challenge to comfort, from reason to emotion, from links to likes, from decentralization to centralization. This is what's happened. And it brings back Neil Postman's amazing argument about what is television is doing, what kind of damage television is doing to our public discourse. I think everybody should read this book. It's very easy, but at the same time quite elaborate and intellectual in terms of its depth. This is a very key quote from him. It doesn't apply to the Americans, obviously, only now. The Americans no longer talk to each other, they entertain each other. They do not exchange ideas, they exchange images. If you've followed any sort of campaigns, presidential campaigns, anywhere actually in the world now, I think you can agree with this statement. He wrote that in 1985, which was the peak of the television dominance on around the world, actually, but he obviously talked about the US. So, going back to this picture, what's the most unusual is not that nobody holds a newspaper anymore, it's that they were wearing hats. To me, I think that's a very shocking difference now with today. But it's also related to the disappearance of the newspapers, because they somehow disappeared around the same time, or started to actually disappear around the same time, sorry. Because hats apparently, and the reason was that they lost their main functions or their use. So hats were protecting us, mostly, receding hairs, like many other men here, against the sun, against rain, and all that. It was also very stylish. It had many different functions. But then when the automobiles came about and personal cars came about, apparently hats became unpopular because you didn't need them, first of all. You were protected already by the roof of your car. And it wasn't actually even, it wasn't very easy to wear them because of the roof being very close to your head. That's how hats suddenly almost disappeared. Now, there are some people who are wearing hats. There are also some people who are still reading newspapers, paper newspapers, but they're very rare. So, obviously, journalism is in crisis. We all know. I don't think we need to argue the fact that journalism is in crisis, is in a deep crisis after 200 years. But it wouldn't hurt to know some figures. So this is the circulation. It also includes digital circulation. It's not just print in the US. Isn't that shocking? Because 1941 was the middle of the Second World War. And I think it was after the US involvement, or I don't know exactly know, but maybe right before that. Where was the Pearl Harbor? Anybody knows? What year was it? 1940, probably around 1940, maybe one or two. Anyways, so it was at the peak of the excitement about the war. Yet you see that the newspapers now, in 2017, I'm sure it's worse now. The circulation is even lower. Then the workforce, as you can see, is shocking. And it's happened from 2004. And revenue, almost a third. So what doesn't need to? I think it doesn't need really to argue more for making a case about the decline and the crisis of the newspaper, of journalism. So, but the main discussion now is asking these three questions, mainly. People are discussing it in terms of business models or quality or ethics. There are many, many ideas, so much money being spent on either of these three questions. But I would argue that it's actually deeper than that. It's not about business models or quality or ethics. It's cultural. News, not journalism, because they're different. News is one output of journalism. It has been the main output of journalism for the past 2 centuries. Has lost its cultural relevance, and thus it has lost its commodity value. Nobody wants to pay for news anymore. Why? I think James Carey gives the best answer to this question. He was a media scholar. He was the dean of the Columbia Journalism School for 3 years before he died, unfortunately, in, I think, early 2000. And he wrote this amazing collection of essays on media and society, where he lays out his thesis about looking at the communication as a culture, as something that he calls ritual, which is different from the dominant way people looked at communication, which was transmission of messages from here to here. So he talks about media and communication in a different way, in a cultural way. This summarizes how he defines communication. It's a symbolic process whereby reality is produced, maintained, repaired, and transformed. Obviously, it's also transmitted, but looking at communication as a ritual is very helpful now for us to understand why journalism is declining. He talks about 3 aspects of news, and I argue, and I use these aspects and functions to argue that news has lost or has been challenged in terms of these 3 functions, and that's why it's dying. One is news as drama. News has always had this function of drama. Under a ritual view of communication, he says, news is not information, but drama. It doesn't describe the world, but portrays an arena of dramatic focus and action. Another one, news as nowness, something that is not epic, heroic, general, abstract, timeless. It's timely, it's about now and here, and it's specific, it's not general. News is a desire to do away with the epic, heroic, and traditional in favor of the unique, original, novel, new. And that's why it's called news. The third aspect, which is quite important, is the way it's linked to the globalization, which almost started around 2 centuries ago, and I think they coincided with the emergence of news. It was the first time, it was in the beginning of the middle class's connection to a wider world and to the globalization kind of process that started around that time, especially through business. News is a historic reality. It's a form of culture invented by a particular class at a particular point of history. In this case, by the middle class, largely in the 18th century. So, the news came about to answer certain questions for certain people, to meet certain needs for certain people. And that was the middle class in 18th century, late 18th century. So my argument is that, which I laid out in this piece if you want to look it up, because it's more elaborate and longer, in The Guardian, and then a similar version, but a bit longer on medium.com, is that it's all the 3 functions and uses are now met by huge rivals and challenges, serious challenges. So news as drama is challenged by computer games, PlayStation, Netflix, which produces lots and lots of drama, Twitter. I don't think there's anything more addictive than Twitter for people who have been involved in writing and journalism and these kinds of stuff. And it's so dramatic. It's like a game, eventually. Fox News and CNN, even though they call themselves news, but they're more actually about drama than news, as you probably know. Which is applied to all, I think, commercial news channels around the world now these days. Public television is still quite respectable, but even public television is going that way. So the second aspect of the function, news as globalized experience. What are the challenges? As you can guess, cheap traveling, and Instagram, and YouTube, and satellite television, and many other things, cinema included, they are all becoming a better source, or more interesting source of this experience of globalization. And that's why people are spending their money on these things rather than, subscribing necessarily or buying newspapers and magazines. But obviously 200 years ago, they had the monopoly on many of these things. At the same time, the globalization itself, as we know, is in decline. We are observing a shift from anything that has been global to local things. The rise of identity politics, religion, ethnicity, race, political party, nationalism. All these things are linked to the rise of local artisan products, craft beer, artisan bread, and all kinds of things that are kind of handmade and homemade. They've become trendy and popular. So there is a shift that you can see from the global to the local. And it's quite serious. And I think it's also challenging the interest in globalized experience when it came to the news. So it's also interesting to see that this shift when it comes to the news doesn't necessarily translate to municipal developments, local politics, and those kinds of definitions of local news. News now, the local news now, is actually friends and family updates. This is the way Facebook defines it, and I think it's true to some degree that much of the local news now for people is because they've become so far from the family, they have to work in different cities, nuclear families and all that. They're not in touch with their friends as much anymore. So this is all leading into a new situation where, for most people, actually local news is friends and family updates. That also includes celebrity news, because celebrities are our cousins, basically, that we don't see anymore. So the rise of celebrity news, I argue, that is connected to the local news. So nothing about the conventional definition of news, local news, we see in this shift. So news, the third function, news as nowness, or a detachment from the heroic, the epic, the timeless. The main challenge is mobile phones for the first time. Why? Because if telegraph 200 years ago detached production of news from time, now mobile phones have detached the distribution of news from time. So now the news is bypassed. The events or politicians, persons themselves directly go to the public, directly reach to the public in a way that it never happened before. So that's our reality now. No hats, actually more women active on phones, no newspapers, and I'm sure none of them are actually reading news. I think some of them are playing or chatting or all kinds of stuff, or tweeting. This is the official end of news with this definition. 800 words text with a specific style that was produced by a news organization. So is this the end of journalism, if this is the end of news? No. What we need to do is to reinvent journalism around something else, which is not news. I would argue later on that thing should be drama. But why? Why do we have to reinvent journalism? Let's go back to James Carey, because I think he has the best argument and explanation. He says journalism is democracy. He doesn't say journalism helps democracy. He says they're the same thing. That's quite amazing. And democracy is journalism. And both actually are two words for the same meaning, which to him is public conversation. So if there is no public conversation, it there is no democracy and there's no journalism. And I think we can somehow see that to a degree with the privatization of public sphere and the personalization of truth. We are seeing a collapse of the public conversation and therefore the collapse of democracy and the collapse of journalism, because they're all the same thing. Amazing quote: journalism and politics mutually form one another. They are symbiotic. Democracy and journalism are names of the same thing. And then, without the institutions of democracy, journalists are reduced to propagandists or entertainers. So now, if we need to maintain journalism to keep democracy going and keep this public conversation going, and at the same time, with the collapse of the news, what can we do? I would say the future of journalism is about drama. Drama could be defined as affective narratives. Anything that has an emotional, an effective narrative format or form can be called drama. And this is the realm of art. This must be where art means journalism, because art is about emotions and effective communication. It's not necessarily to impact reason. But it's actually already happening, so we just have to expand it somehow and think about creativity and innovation when it comes to the mix of art and journalism. So I give you some examples that are already happening in terms of long-form narrative, text, audio, and video. Literature and journalism. This is the most familiar, I think. You've seen the success of many non-fiction books around the world. Also, the narrative podcasts, I think, fall into this category. How many people have listened to a narrative podcast in the past 6 months? Do you know about the Serial, the English-speaking podcast, which is apparently quite famous now? Are there any German equivalent for Serial? Do you know of any German narrative podcast? Yes? And you know that Spotify, for example, has invested a lot of new money in podcasting, monetization platforms, and other kinds of services and startups around podcasts. Cinema and journalism, that's also quite famous. Netflix, documentary films, obviously. But also, I think it includes films and TV series based on true stories that I think are growing quite rapidly, and they're becoming quite popular. Painting and journalism, that's also familiar and amazing, actually, if you're a French speaker especially, with the bande dessinée. And all those amazing works that, in English, I think the most famous one is Joe Sacco, if you know him. He's done amazing current affairs work with the form of graphic novels. Then we have theater and journalism. Documentary theater, obviously, if you've seen. I actually translated an amazing play, documentary play, in prison, actually, and then it was published afterwards. I published it a couple of years ago in Iran. The translation from English of My Name is Rachel Corrie, written by The Guardian's now editor-in-chief and Alan Rickman, who was an actor, theatre and cinema, who passed away. It's an amazing documentary theatre play, for example. These kinds of stuff. Even some of the radio plays, if you listen to them, which is an old kind of format, but it could be reinvented and, people can do other things with them in different forms and narratives. But there are also realms that have not been explored yet when it comes to art and journalism. And I encourage everybody to think that way, to innovate, to create, to be creative about what you can do about these other art forms. Music and journalism. Think about, music albums, hip-hop, which could be maybe easier because you can talk more. There are more words in it. Think about an album, for example, that tells the story of Brexit, That could be quite boring. The Russian intervention, for example, in elections, about bots and disinformation, about all kinds of things that you can imagine. There could be music that could do the job of journalism, which is, talking about facts and current affairs in the world, and it could be educational, informative. But it would be using the format of music. Then dance and journalism you can think of, especially contemporary dance, where you can mix all kinds of things, video and text and music and all that. But then, when I was doing this presentation, I came with this idea of mixing all these, and it actually has a name already, which is opera. So imagine there are operas written in a very rich way, and I think people are ready to pay hundreds of euros for an opera that covers the rise of Putin, for example, to power. Contemporary issues could be. This would be a perfect medium for journalism. So going back to this, I think both hats and newspapers have disappeared, or are disappearing. The newspapers, it's the last maybe few years of, especially the German broadsheets, where you can completely hide behind them. And I think nowhere in the world there are so many broadsheets read by people, actually. I really admire the German people who are still buying and reading these broadsheets. But these are the last days. And as Kerry suggested, if we want to save democracy, we have to save journalism, or vice versa. Thank you very much. You can find me on Twitter, and that's my email as well.
I think we might have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Are you up for that? For
yes.
1 or 2 questions? Yes?
Yeah.
Do we have questions from the audience? Okay, that makes it easy.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
TL.